A little girl is dead, and prosecutors say the people who should have protected her are the ones responsible for her pain. A Florida mother and stepfather face a long list of charges, including second-degree murder after authorities say their 5-year-old daughter endured horrific abuse. Court records show the child was beaten, bound, and neglected. Now, her family is speaking out, blaming not only the parents, but what they call a broken system that failed to save that child. I'm Kennedi Walker, and you're watching Law&Crime. We begin in Tallahassee, Florida, where 5-year-old Melissa Mogle will never get the chance to grow up. Her family called her Missy. She loved to play and dance, but just months shy of her 6th birthday, her life was cut too soon. Police say 23-year-old Chloe Spencer and her husband, 35-year-old Daniel Spencer, are responsible for her death. They're accused of violently abusing Missy, allegedly hitting her and tying up her wrist. The investigation began just before 7:45 a.m. on May 19th, when officers were called to a home for reports of an unresponsive child. Missy's grandfather was performing CPR when police arrived. She was rushed to Tallahassee Memorial but was pronounced dead shortly after. Court documents obtained by WCTV reveal Missy was covered in bruises on her legs, back, arms, and butt. They also noted signs of binding around her wrist and cuts on her face. The Spencers reportedly told police their daughter had behavioral issues and would hold her breath during tantrums to manipulate them. Daniel said she had one of those tantrums the morning she died, so he left her standing in the bedroom and walked away. Moments later, he says she was unresponsive. But police uncovered surveillance footage from a camera in Missy's room that tells a different story. Detectives say the video shows hours of abuse, allegedly showing Missy being struck and her face pushed into a bed. The documents say other video shows Chloe Spencer standing over Missy, who was curled in the fetal position on her bed, holding an object above her head as if preparing to hit her. An autopsy later revealed Missy was severely malnourished. Chloe Spencer reportedly told detectives Missy had been sick the weekend before her death and that she planned to take her to the hospital, but never did. In that same interview, Chloe allegedly said that Daniel had been receiving treatment for an addiction to illegal narcotics and that he had been beating Missy with a belt twice a day for weeks. Daniel, in turn, blamed Chloe for the abuse. But the signs of danger and cries for help came long before Missy's death. According to the Tallahassee Democrat, the Florida Department of Children and Families received a hotline tip in July 2024, nearly a year before Missy died, that Daniel Spencer was sexually abusing the child. Missy allegedly said that her stepfather put his hands around her throat and touched her inappropriately while he was angry. Family court records showed the state's child welfare agency ended up dropping its investigation because the girl's mother signed a power of attorney for her to live with an aunt, with a promise that she'd have no contact with Daniel Spencer. But months later, Missy was returned to the same home. Authorities also investigated the sexual abuse allegation, but said there was not enough probable cause to file charges. It wasn't the first time. Records show Chloe Spencer previously reported that Daniel physically abused her, but no arrest was made. That same year, Daniel was arrested in an unrelated child sexting called Operation Spring Cleaning after attempting to meet what he thought was a 15-year-old girl. He was found guilty, and though prosecutors asked that he remain behind bars pending sentencing, a judge released him. Missy's godmother, Jasmine Hartsfield, says all of these missed warnings led to a deadly outcome. In an interview with the Tallahassee Democrat, she said, quote, "They were supposed to protect her from these monsters, and they did nothing but let it happen." No one was arrested for Missy's abuse until after she died. Chloe and Daniel Spencer are charged with second-degree murder, aggravated battery on a child, child neglect with bodily harm, and failure to report child abuse. And joining me to talk more about this is criminal defense attorney Michael Gottlieb. Michael, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's start with what everyone is asking. How could something like this happen? There were reports of physical abuse, alleged sexual abuse, even a child sexting involving the stepfather. How does a child like Missy still end up back in the home?
That's an interesting question, and one in which we need to look to see whether or not there were failures of the system. If Department of Children and Families knew, they should have taken action. They should have taken the child out of the home. They should have looked for a better caregiver for the child. Obviously, people are screaming that the stepfather here should have been in jail. He's already pled to a sex crime the week before. The state attorney, Jack Campbell himself, is saying, I don't understand why this individual who has pled to a sex trafficking charge or reaching out to young children for sexual crimes wasn't already in jail. So, look, I think the system works. And in most cases, it is a great system. This does seem to be a failure of the system to work to protect this child.
I want to thank Odoo for sponsoring this news package. Odoo is an incredible all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications. One of my favorite Odoo applications is their sales tool. The Kanban pipeline is a game changer. Whether you're working with leads or full-blown opportunities, you can visually track every stage of your sales process. Just drag and drop to move deals forward. It's fast and honestly kind of satisfying. When it's time to send a quote, it's literally a couple clicks. And the reporting, super clear. You get a live view of your pipeline, conversions, and what's working so you can focus on closing, not guessing. So right now you can get a free 15-day trial of Odoo's all-in-one business solution and see how it can make your life easier. Check it out at www.odoo.com/lcnewscrm. Is it a failure of the child welfare system, law enforcement, the courts? Who gets the blame here?
Well, I think it's a little early in this case to blame the courts. Whether the stepfather should have been surrendered or not is a question. And I don't know if the state attorney on that case asked for a surrender or not, on the pre-existing case asked for a surrender or not. We don't know the reasons that the judge allowed him to be out on bond. It's really not all that uncommon for somebody to be out on bond pending the case, out on bond pending sentencing, if they haven't knowingly violated the conditions of bond. So I don't know that you can blame the court system. I don't know that you can blame the police. We don't know if the police had been involved in previous incidents of allegations of child abuse. I think it's a little early to tell in the investigation of the case. We do know that there had been, I guess, allegations of child abuse through DCF, and DCF probably should have looked into it. So perhaps they're to blame, but I think it's really early in a case like this to start laying blame on anybody other than the parents.
Yeah, that's true. But while it is early, is there ever a legal obligation for agencies like DCF or police to keep children separated from someone at least accused of abuse, even if there's no probable cause to the arrest?
Oh yeah, 100%. So it's a much lower standard to take the child away from the parents. And I think the what you're asking me is, when is the onus on law enforcement or on DCF to take action? It's when they learn of the abuse, and when they go out, they investigate, and they don't have to rise to probable cause. Probable cause really isn't even that high, though. It's more likely than not. So I believe they use a standard of preponderance of the evidence, which is 51%. There's really not much difference. That's not a high threshold. If there's evidence of abuse, we need to consider removing the child from the individual, because it might not be both parents. In this case, it clearly is. It might not be both parents, but we need to remove the child from the caregiver that is causing the abuse.
What would need to be different in order for someone like Daniel Spencer to have been kept away from Missy permanently? Is it a policy issue or a legal threshold problem?
I think it's just notice. I'm not aware that DCF was on notice. I'm not aware of law enforcement having been on notice that Daniel was abusing the child. I don't know if the grandparents complained before. I mean, we know there were belt marks, there were bruises. There appears to be defensive wounds to the child in terms of on the hands. Either they're beating the hands or the child is, putting up its own hands to stop from being abused. But we don't know who knew about that. So we don't know if it's been reported. I don't think I've seen anything that said that this was previously reported to the police. This is just one incident where I think the grandfather called and said the child is non-responsive. Grandfather's doing CPR, and then the police get there. I don't know if there was a preceding police investigation.
I read some reports of, I'm thinking the child's godmother, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she says something along the lines of Missy allegedly admitted that her stepfather was allegedly abusing her, and the godmother brought it to police, and police dropped it because there wasn't enough probable cause. So I think that's where a lot of, or some of the outrage is coming from, because family members tried to report it, but police didn't, in their words, take it seriously.
So the question is then, what was reported to the police, and what lengths did the police go to investigate it? If they didn't act on that tip, and that's a known tip. So if an individual says, I reported it, I went to the police, I told them who I am, that's a known tip. That tip comes with a high level of credibility because we know who's making the allegation. So the police have an obligation at that point in time to go out to the house to do what's known as a welfare check. So if they did a welfare check, they checked on the child, and the child didn't have bruises or didn't have indicia of abuse, and the house looked clean, the child looked well nourished, there was food, there wasn't feces everywhere, which, we see cases like that, then the police have done their job. So just because somebody says I complained and there wasn't probable cause doesn't mean the police didn't do their job. Again, I'd really like to know, before I lay blame on the police, what kind of allegation did they have and what kind of action did they take?
Let's talk about the child sexting arrest with the stepfather, because he was found guilty of that. Do you think law enforcement and prosecutors could have done more with the information that they had? Like, if a person is found guilty of that, how was he allowed to go back home, even though he was pending sentencing?
So that's an interesting question, which really goes back to the day that he got arrested. The day he gets arrested, he has to go see a magistrate judge. So when you go see a magistrate judge, you get bond. And the question is, what were the conditions of bond? Was he allowed to be around minor children? Was he allowed to be around minor children of the same sex or of a different sex? Was he allowed to be around minor children? Did somebody ask at some point in time for him to be allowed to be allowed to be around minor children that he is the caregiver for? So those are all different conditions that a court could have set to protect this child. And if the mom came forward and said, yeah, I'm not afraid of him sexually abusing my child, and we don't know if there's any evidence of him sexually abusing this child, because there is a distinct difference between physical abuse and physical sexual abuse. Not all physical abusers engage in physical sexual abuse. So I'd like to know what conditions of bond were set on his pending criminal case, what the court knew in order to take precautions. Maybe the court didn't even know that he had children living in the home.
Right. Okay, well, let's talk about the charges. Chloe and Daniel Spencer are both facing second-degree murder, in addition to felony charges, including aggravated battery and child neglect with great bodily harm. What do these charges mean legally, and how do prosecutors begin to prove them?
So number one, I wouldn't count on those being the charges moving forward. I think there is, such outrage over acts like this. And we know that the prosecuting entity, Jack Campbell, I think he's going to do a great job. I happen to know him. I think he's a great prosecutor. You can suspect, or expect rather, that his office may file first-degree murder charges on Daniel. So we know Daniel was the last person to see the child in the room, left the room, and then the grandfather finds the child unresponsive. So you could see a first-degree murder charge there. Now, first-degree murder can be brought as a premeditated intention to kill the child, or in the act of child abuse, a dangerous felony, caused the death of the child. So I think that the police made a second-degree murder arrest, but that doesn't mean that the state attorney has to stick with that. As it relates to the mother, I think you can see probably either maybe a murder too. That might be a stretch if she didn't know about the beating that was taking place at the time, but certainly a manslaughter charge and a manslaughter by negligence charge for the failure to act. The aggravated child abuse charges, some are caught on video. I mean, they had a video camera in the child's room, which really goes to show that, these are evil people. They're filming it. Are they watching it later? Are they selling it? Like, what's going on? Why would you record yourself abusing this child? Really doesn't make any sense. And it shows
Absolutely. And you actually bring up a good point there just about the surveillance being in the room. Could the mother, obviously anyone can argue anything, but could she argue that she didn't know about it given that there was a camera in Missy's room?
I don't think so. She's admitted it. So from what I've read, the mother admitted it, the father admitted it. They both kind of pointed the finger at one another. So I don't think she's, maybe she has a defense that he beat me too. And I had no choice but to stay in this relationship. I don't know. I'm posturing that's a possibility. But I really don't know.
And speaking of that, of them just pointing the blame on each other, is that something that you would recommend, just being a good strategy moving forward to potentially get less jail time for either of them?
I wouldn't be concerned about him getting less jail time. He's got a sentencing pending. This is coming out. You could expect a relatively heavy-handed sentence, because I think the court can take into consideration these allegations, even though they haven't been proven and he hasn't been convicted. It's conduct that he engaged in. I think you can see the state attorney likely arguing this is conduct that he engaged in while pending sentencing in the case. And therefore, this is an individual who cannot conform their behavior to societal norms. Add the video into that and you say this is a truly depraved individual, you can see the state attorney likely asking for, on the pending case, the maximum punishment. And then pushing the father for a consecutive sentence on this other case and trying to get him to just plead to life in prison, as opposed to potentially asking for the death penalty if they do file a murder in the first degree. The mother, she could potentially give testimony towards the father's case, since he seems to be the person who engaged in the abuse on this occasion that caused the death, in exchange for a lesser sentence.
Now, I do have a question about just the charges, because prosecutors waited to charge the Spencers with murder. That wasn't immediate. At first, it was, the abuse charges, and then the second-degree murder came a few days after that. In cases like this where the child tragically dies, why might prosecutors hold off on a murder charge, at least initially?
I've never been a prosecutor, so I don't necessarily know. But there are strategic reasons. When you charge somebody with murder, different things are triggered. So there are strategic reasons as to why a prosecutor may wait to file more egregious charges. You can get a more extensive bond hearing. You can get a little bit more discovery on a murder charge. Anything punishable by life, you have to go through an Arthur hearing. But at the same point in time, you can also get a much more significant hold, meaning a bond hold. So I don't know. There are strategy reasons as to why a prosecutor may hold off on filing certain charges.
Well, you're a criminal defense attorney, so how would you handle if your client was at first charged with, abuse or things of that nature, and then a week later slapped with this second-degree murder charge? How exactly would you go about fighting that? And could you argue that maybe the videos were taken out of context or misinterpreted?
It's hard to say a video is taken out of context or misinterpreted when you're beating a child. However, I have had video cases before where the videos don't necessarily, especially inexpensive household videos, they don't necessarily record at a frame rate that our eye sees at. So they're not doing 30 frames per second. So if they're doing less frames per second, the intensity of the beating could look more severe because it's sped up, if that makes sense. And they may do that for purposes of video storage. So that would be one potential argument. As I said, the mother may have an argument as well that that she was being abused. I don't know. I'm posturing that, she was in an abusive relationship. She had no choice but to engage in the abuse, or she was going to be abused herself. She couldn't escape. Her life was threatened. Who knows what she may come up with? She hasn't said that yet, so I don't know what she's going to say. You would also want to look into the mental health of both of these individuals. As I said, these are depraved acts. These are not the acts of a right-minded thinking person. So maybe they have some kind of mental disease or defect that may provide them with a legal defense.
And I guess do things just get tricky when it comes to spanking? Could a defense attorney say, hey, there was no intent here. I was just trying to spank my child. Spanking isn't illegal. How would they just go about arguing that aspect of it?
So yeah, 100% disciplining the child is an affirmative defense. It's even an affirmative defense to killing the child. So if it was, I was disciplining the child was acting out, I didn't intend to harm the child in my discipline. Discipline has been known as an actual affirmative defense. So if they have a child that, had a behavioral history, of acting out, they can assert that defense of, look, we were just engaging in what would ordinarily be normal discipline. So I think what you'd have at that point in time is an expert witness in child abuse coming in and saying this goes above and beyond what is acceptable discipline for a child of this age. You shouldn't expect to see the bruises, so on and so forth. But I think coupled with that, you have an allegation of malnourishment. So you're not malnourishing a child in order to punish the child. So I think if you combine the two of them together, it would be a difficult case to defend against. But absolutely, if I were handling the case and my client is telling me, look, I was simply disciplining the child, I would go with discipline as an affirmative defense.
Right. So I guess where things get tricky, like how you said, is the child, according to her autopsy, being malnourished. And how exactly would you fight that? Because malnourished, that just means what? They weren't eating, they weren't drinking. That's not good.
Right. I mean, they're not appropriately feeding the child. Absent a medical condition, that's going to be problematic. So you'd want to see, were they even taking the child to a doctor? If I'm prosecuting the case. And if they were, I would want to use that as a defense. Well, the doctor told me we're hitting all the marks that we're supposed to with a child for this age. I'm not aware of any malnourishment. Nobody ever told me my child was malnourished. Some people are thin, some people aren't. So we all have different body types. And if the mom has, I know she has other children. If the children, they're all thin, you might say, well, I didn't appreciate that this child was malnourished, or she had, eat. We were trying to get her to eat. Nobody really knows at this point in time, but certainly there would be defenses there if they took the child to the doctor, or if there was any childcare involved and nobody from childcare was saying, hey, your child is, doesn't appear to be eating, doesn't want to eat, or comes here and all they want to do is eat because it appears they're not getting any food at home.
Is it possible that one of them could take a plea deal, or with a case as strong as this one, with all of the evidence, that most likely won't be offered?
No, I could suspect that since the mom doesn't appear, it's difficult because she is the biological mother to the child. So it's a difficult situation, because not that she has, listen, this is the stepfather. They both have the same obligation as caregivers. The child's in their care, their custody, their control. They have an obligation to take care of this child. But you would expect that the mother with a biological bond would really be the nurturer of the child. So it's difficult to give the nurturer a better deal in the murder of a child than the person who committed the act. But he did commit the act, according to the police, according to the allegations, that caused the child's death. So, you could see them giving the mother, especially if the mother comes forward and says, look, I was abused, then she becomes a little more sympathetic as an individual, and you give her a plea deal. And I'm not suggesting 5 years. You could see the government still giving her a heavy-handed deal, 20 years in prison for the death of her own child. You also have to consider she has other children at home, and they are going to be victimized by the loss of their mother. So the state attorney may want to take that into consideration and give her a deal if she testifies against the stepfather for the killing of the child.
Absolutely. Well, this is something that we will be following very closely here at Law and Crime. Michael, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on.
Chloe and Daniel Spencer both remain behind bars and are being held without bond. A judge has ordered that they have no contact with each other or their other 3 children who are now in the state's custody. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.